Sergeant Dan Marshall thought he had apprehended just another overly confident black man on a routine traffic stop. Little did he know, within mere hours, his career would spiral into complete chaos, and his name would become infamous across the country.
Why?
Because the man he had just handcuffed wasn't any ordinary driver. He had arrested the state attorney general himself. What unfolded next left even the most experienced and jaded observers utterly speechless. But let's rewind and start from the beginning of this disastrous chain of events. Sergeant Dan Marshall sat slouched in his patrol car, staring lazily at the quiet, empty road stretched before him. The night had been uneventful, boring, even, and he found himself itching for some excitement. That's when he spotted it, a sleek black sedan cruising by, moving just a hair faster than the rest. The driver, a black man dressed in a sharp, expensive suit, exuded a confidence that irked Marshall to his core. Who does he think he is? Marshall muttered under his breath, narrowing his eyes. He didn't like it when someone, especially a black man, carried themselves as though the rules didn't apply to them. Gotcha, Marshall muttered smugly, flipping on his patrol lights. The sedan slowed down and obediently pulled to the side of the road. As Marshall approached the vehicle, his irritation only grew. The driver didn't appear flustered or nervous, which only made him more determined to assert his authority. Marshall rapped on the window with his knuckles, signaling the man to lower it. "License and registration," he barked. The driver calmly handed over the requested documents, his demeanor cool and collected. "Is there an issue, officer?" he asked, his tone steady. "You were speeding," Marshall lied, relishing the opportunity to put this man in his place. The driver arched an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "I was going 35 in a 40 zone," he replied, his voice tinged with restrained annoyance. Marshall bristled at the response. That tone, the calm, assured way the man spoke, was unbearable to him. He despised when anyone, particularly a black man, spoke to him as if they were equals. He peered into the car, searching for any signs of wrongdoing. But the interior was pristine, no open containers, no weapons, no drugs. Frustrated, Marshall snapped, "Step out of the vehicle." "On what grounds?" the man questioned, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Don't make me use force," Marshall growled, his hand hovering near his cuffs. The man sighed, stepped out of the car, and placed his hands on the hood without resistance. "You're making a serious mistake, officer," he said firmly. Marshall sneered, twisting the man's arm behind his back. "I decide what's a mistake," he snapped, snapping the handcuffs on with unnecessary force. "You're under arrest for resisting." The man didn't resist, nor did he argue further. But as Marshall locked eyes with him, he felt a strange and unexpected unease. There was no fear in the man's gaze, only a sharp, calculating look that sent a chill down Marshall's spine. "You'll regret this," the man said, his voice steady and unnervingly calm. Marshall laughed dismissively, leading the man to his patrol car. He had no idea how hauntingly accurate those words would soon become. Back at the precinct, Marshall relished the moment of triumph as he guided his detainee through the corridors. He lived for this, the moment when people realized they were truly in trouble. "Take a seat, boss," Marshall said mockingly, shoving the man into the interrogation room. The man sat down without a word, crossing his arms. His posture was relaxed, his demeanor calm, so unlike the panicked or angry outbursts Marshall had come to expect from detainees. Only his eyes hinted at something sharp and calculating. "What's your name?" Marshall asked lazily as he began scribbling on the report. "Derek Williams," the man replied evenly. The name briefly tugged at Marshall's memory, but he shrugged it off. "You act like you're someone important," he scoffed, eyeing the man's suit with disdain. "Think that fancy outfit impresses anyone?" Williams didn't respond. Instead, he offered a faint smirk that only fueled Marshall's irritation. He stomped off to the duty desk, where Officer Johnson was entering the detainee's information into the system. Suddenly, Johnson stiffened. His eyes widened in shock, and he turned to Marshall, his face pale. "Dan, do you realize who you just arrested?" Marshall frowned. "What are you talking about?" Wordlessly, Johnson turned the computer screen toward him. Marshall stared at the image on the monitor. Derek Williams' official government photo. Bold letters beneath the image read State Attorney General. A cold wave of dread washed over Marshall. "You're joking," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Johnson shook his head, his tone urgent. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? That man oversees every police officer in this state. He fights corruption and abuse of power, and you just arrested him on a bogus charge." Marshall's heart pounded in his chest. "Maybe he'll let it slide," he stammered, grasping at straws. "Look outside," Johnson snapped, jerking his head toward the window. Marshall turned, and his stomach dropped. A sea of journalists swarmed the precinct's entrance, cameras flashing and microphones raised. Just then, the interrogation room door opened. Derek Williams emerged, flanked by the precinct's lieutenant and chief. His voice was calm but carried a weight of authority as he addressed Marshall directly. "Officer Marshall," he began, his tone icy, "I'd suggest you find yourself a competent lawyer." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a business card, and placed it on the desk in front of the stunned officer. "And just so you know, I will absolutely be attending your hearing." Marshall couldn't muster a response. He could only watch, frozen, as Derek Williams strode out of the precinct, cameras flashing and reporters shouting questions. In that moment, as the doors closed behind him, Marshall knew his career was finished. Dan Marshall had been assured this was nothing more than a formality, but a gnawing feeling in his gut told him otherwise. Something wasn't right. The heavy courtroom doors swung open, and in walked Derek Williams. Every eye in the room turned toward him as he moved with an air of authority, dressed in a tailored suit that seemed to command respect with every step. He didn't rush. Each movement was deliberate, exuding the quiet confidence of a man who knew he was in control. His mere presence hushed the crowd, silencing even the most skeptical onlookers. Marshall felt his body involuntarily tense as Williams passed him without so much as a glance. The prosecutor calmly took his seat at the table, his gaze finally locking with Marshall's. There was no anger in those piercing eyes, no sign of outrage, just a cold, calculating intensity that made Marshall's stomach churn. "Court is now in session," the judge declared, stepping into the room. "We are here today to address the case of the unlawful arrest of Derek Williams by Officer Daniel Marshall." Marshall swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the words as if they were a gavel striking his chest. Williams stood gracefully, his voice steady and commanding. "Your Honor, I request that this trial be fully public and transparent. Let the people witness the system in action. Let them see how it works." The judge nodded. "Proceed." The first piece of evidence presented was the arrest video. The screen flickered to life, displaying the footage of Marshall demanding that Williams exit his vehicle without cause. The video showed Marshall slapping handcuffs on the man with unwarranted force. Gasps rippled through the audience, and journalists whispered frantically, their pens and cameras capturing every reaction. "Officer Marshall," Williams began, his voice cutting through the murmurs, "you claimed I resisted arrest. Do you see any resistance in this footage?" Marshall's throat tightened. His mouth felt dry as he stammered, "Well, not exactly." "You fabricated the charges," Williams stated firmly, his gaze unwavering. "I was just doing my job." Marshall blurted out defensively, but the words had barely left his mouth when he realized his mistake. The judge's gavel slammed down. "Order in the court." Williams continued, his tone steady and resolute. "The truth is, Sergeant, you are a product of a broken system, a system that has shielded misconduct for far too long. Today, this courtroom is not just deciding your fate. It's weighing the fate of countless others who have endured injustice at the hands of unchecked authority." Marshall clenched his fists under the table but said nothing. He could feel the walls closing in around him. After hours of deliberation, the judge delivered the ruling. "Officer Daniel Marshall, you are hereby suspended from duty, effective immediately. Furthermore, a criminal case for abuse of power is now open against you." Marshall felt as though the ground beneath him had vanished. His head spun as the weight of the judgment settled on his shoulders. Williams rose from his seat with quiet dignity. Without sparing Marshall a glance, he strode out of the courtroom, leaving the officer to drown in the chaos he had created. Cameras flashed and reporters clamored outside, their voices rising in a chaotic symphony as they captured the moment. Marshall slumped in his chair, knowing deep down that his career and his life had been irreparably damaged. 2 weeks later, Marshall sat in his dim, smoke-filled apartment, staring blankly at the TV. The evening news blared on, the anchor announcing, "Police scandal. Racist arrest of the Attorney General." His own face appeared on the screen, side by side with Derek Williams. "Damn it," he muttered, reaching for a bottle of whiskey. He thought the system would protect him, as it always had. But once the case had gone public, every ally had abandoned him. The next morning, Marshall's badge no longer granted him access to the station. "Sergeant, you're suspended," the receptionist said softly, avoiding eye contact. "This is all politics," Marshall barked. "I was just doing my job," the receptionist sighed. "Orders from above. They want you at headquarters." At headquarters, Marshall found himself facing the police commissioner and a team of lawyers. The commissioner's tone was sharp and unsympathetic. "Sergeant Marshall, you're under internal investigation." Marshall exhaled sharply, shaking his head in frustration. "All because of Williams?" The commissioner's expression hardened. "Not just him. We've reviewed your record, complaints, violations, even video evidence. You've drawn too much attention, Dan. We can't cover for you anymore." "You're throwing me away like garbage," Marshall growled. "You've become toxic," the commissioner replied coldly. "The department needs to rebuild its image." Marshall felt his world crumble. 20 years of service, gone in an instant. The system he had relied on, manipulated, and trusted to shield him had turned its back. A week later, he sat across from his lawyer, who laid out the grim reality. "Dan, this is serious. Plead guilty, take a deal, and you'll avoid prison. But you'll lose your badge forever." "I'm not pleading guilties," Marshall shouted. The lawyer slid a phone across the table, playing a damning audio recording of Marshall's own voice. "They're always hiding something. Keep them scared." "This is a setup," Marshall yelled. "No, Dan," the lawyer said quietly. "These are just consequences." The final trial was a spectacle, with cameras capturing every second. Marshall sat at the defense table, his fists clenched, his face pale. When the judge entered, the courtroom fell silent. "Daniel Marshall," the judge began, "this court finds you guilty on all counts. You are hereby barred from law enforcement and sentenced to 3 years of probation." The room buzzed with murmurs. Some clapped, others whispered, but Marshall sat frozen, staring at the floor. The harsh reality had finally sunk in. As the courtroom emptied, Marshall found himself face to face with Derek Williams in the hallway. "Happy now?" Marshall growled. Williams adjusted his cufflinks, his expression calm. "Justice has prevailed, Sergeant." He paused before adding, "The system didn't fail you. It just doesn't work for you anymore." With that, Williams turned and walked away, leaving Marshall standing alone, surrounded by the shattered remains of his career and his illusions. Outside, reporters celebrated what they called a victory for justice, while Marshall's name became a cautionary tale for all who thought they could act without accountability.